Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Who is the scariest person you've ever met? My old boss. I swear he was like a robot or something. If he wanted to have a meeting with you, he would come up to you with a wide grin and say, "Can we have a little chat in my office?" Nothing serious. His voice would always sound friendly, but there was absolutely nothing behind the eyes, and no actual emotion in his voice, just pretense. This faux friendly demeanor would continue throughout the meeting, and you could tell that it was covering up for seething anger over whatever tiny FCK up you happened to have made. I hated even seeing him, and I was always excited for the 2 days of my week where he worked on a different site. I clerked for a criminal trial judge for a year after law school. I've met a bunch of murderers and the like, including one who executed a man for reporting his counterfeiting scheme to the police and a woman who killed her child. Anyway, the scariest person I ever met was at my first attorney job at a firm that specializes in representing homeowners associations with debt collection. One associate attorney constantly got excited when he talked about getting judgments against people who didn't pay their HOA fees and putting liens on their properties, effectively making sure their financial hardships will last for years. Unlike the murderers I met, he had no soul in his eyes. I knew a guy in college who would befriend attractive single women, but only one at a time. He'd then make it his mission to become their best friend. While he was with them, he'd be super kind and loving, always flirty but never crossing the line, to the point where he seemed to intentionally get them wanting to date him without ever asking them out. While he was with his guy friends, however, or women he didn't find attractive, he'd openly talk about his fantasies of torturing and murdering people, particularly women. On 2 separate occasions I remember a group of us approaching the woman he was currently hanging out with and asking her to be careful. One just brushed us off and told us we were being ridiculous, but the other actually became furious that we would mischaracterize him like that. I'll never forget her saying, "We spend all night cuddling and talking. I know him better than anyone and he would never say that." Then the next day, there he'd be, joking about how funny it would be to push a woman down the stairs and watch her head split open on the pavement. Eventually he stopped hanging out with us, I assume because he caught on that we were blowing up his game. As far as I know, he never actually did harm any of these women, but it was terrifying how he seemed to get off on knowing that he could. I worked in a behavioral management unit in a maximum security prison for a couple years. It's a unit that houses borderline personality cases, sociopaths, psychopaths, etc. Basically a small unit to house the most disruptive inmates in the DOC. We had an inmate who was in prison for burning down a building with a bunch of people in it due to selling his girlfriend some bad drugs. He killed at least one of them, I don't remember the particulars. This inmate was usually polite, courteous, hard-working, everything you'd want from an inmate. Hell, we'd watch Jeopardy most nights and I would be blown away by his ability to answer a massive majority of the answers correctly. Then suddenly he wouldn't be okay. The most minor perceived slight or minor transgression would change him. He would shut down and become incredibly violent. And he was so strong. He looked forward to the violence, kind of like Captured in the Bronson movie. It happened intermittently, but when it did he was a force to be reckoned with. We never had it out, but I was always aware that when I was speaking to him, it wasn't like I wasn't having a normal conversation. It was like he had programmed responses that were designed to be exactly what I wanted to hear. Then there are the eyes. You hear the saying often, inside the walls, nothing behind the eyes. He was the only one I ever really felt that. His glare felt dangerous, and I can't really compare it to anything I've ever experienced before or since. He made it through the program. Eventually, the carrot that they dangled was a choice of what prison they would like to transfer to. He chose one that had a particular staff member that crossed him too many times years and years back. He was going there to kill them. He waited years for the opportunity. Luckily he slipped up and someone caught on before he could make it there. Without a doubt the most dangerous person I have ever met. There was no doubt in my mind that if he had the opportunity and he felt like he needed to, he wouldn't hesitate to kill me. I am so glad he'll never see the streets again. An extremely notorious gang member. I wondered why bikies had started hanging around the apartments I lived in. Then one day I got in the elevator and saw him with a massive dude who was obviously his personal protection that day. Thought to myself, isn't that the dude I've seen in the media? OFCK, it is. We talked about dogs until I got off on my floor. Good guy to talk pets with, but I always checked to make sure no one looked like they were hanging around to do a drive-by shooting before I walked into the building after that. I met Dan Severn at a small Detroit wrestling show once. I wasn't really into the wrestling, so I wandered over to his table to chat with him. I think I asked 1 or 2 questions and he went on for 20 to 30 minutes. He was incredibly kind to talk to me, but the stuff he said was terrifying. He described how I could have easily killed everyone in the ring in horrific detail. I don't know I have ever met someone I was so positive could end my life immediately. I didn't know him, but when I was in a shopping center, there was a guy who genuinely looked like a zombie. To describe what he looked like: yellow and black teeth, most already gone, greenish wrinkly skin, weird posture, white hair that was falling out, and a weird smile that terrified me. I know the guy was probably sick or something, but he still terrified me. A friend of my brother's, who cornered me in the kitchen in the middle of the night when we were all hanging out at my sister's place and everyone else was asleep. I was trying to politely sidle around him to get away, but he kept outmaneuvering me. It was just mildly irritating at first. I was tired and wanted to go to bed, until he finally stood blatantly in the middle of the door and said something to the effect of, "God, you're so uncomfortable, you keep messing with your hair, you can't even make eye contact with me." Irritation turned immediately to fear, because he went from social idiot who can't take a hint to predator who knows exactly what he's doing in a snap. He held that position for just a few seconds, but it felt like hours, until he finally let me go. I had planned on sleeping on the living room floor. The creep was in the guest bedroom and my brother had passed out on the living room couch, but I was so freaked out went and crawled in bed with my sister. I didn't sleep that night. Long ago, in a small, Eastern European country that shall remain nameless, I was out to eat at a fancy restaurant with some locals, when they suddenly went very silent as a small, well-dressed man sat down at our table without invitation. He proceeded to politely ask me about America in broken English. It wasn't until we left the restaurant that one of the locals quietly said he was one of the top mob bosses in the country, a murderer among other things. My high school English teacher, I suppose he was the over-friendly type of teacher. He was friends with all his students on Facebook/Instagram. He would always see your stories, pictures and compliments you, but it always felt as if he was too friendly and too touchy-feely. It finally blew up when lots of female students made an anonymous page sharing tons of screenshots of him texting and sexually harassing them. Some even shared about how he would inappropriately touching them, but they were all too afraid to report him because they thought no one would believe them. He was a very nice teacher after all. I just can't believe that he was a pedophile. He had a daughter close in age to those that he harassed. It is always make me scared when you find that a person you made frequent contact with is that creepy. I worked as an EMT for 4 years. I didn't quit. Now I'm a paramedic. My partner and I were sent out to an extremely sketchy hotel to pick up a patient for PD. Basically, this guy had been arrested for something, was now swearing up and down that he had chest pain to waste the time of as many people as possible. An ambulance crew had to be dispatched to take him to the hospital in restraints. An officer had to sit with him there until he was cleared, etc. When we arrived, he was crying loudly, sitting on the sidewalk between 2 cops. I took exactly one look at him and I was terrified. I could feel my heart rate jump and my hands start to shake. My larger male partner said he'd sit in the back with him. So this guy cries the whole time we put him on the gurney and restrain him. If you're arrested or a danger to us, you get soft restraints tying your wrists and ankles to the gurney. He sobs loudly, talking about how much his chest hurts and how he didn't even do anything. My partner at the time, being better than the rest of us, was polite, professional and kind. The moment the cops were out of sight and he was shut in the back of the ambulance for the ride to the hospital, it was like a switch flipped. His face was utterly, perfectly neutral. He stopped making any noise at all. I will never forget the way he looked at my partner. I've read a lot of books talking about a calculating gaze, but I'd never seen one before. So a couple of weeks later we find out why he was being arrested. He had flung bleach into the eyes of a cashier for disrespecting him. She was now permanently blind. If you're scared of someone for no reason, you're probably not scared of them for no reason. The man who was the dad of one of my childhood friends who molested me, but even worse, the wife who put me back to bed during the sleepover, telling me everything would be okay and not to tell anyone. You would have never guessed they were these type of people. Total normal church-going, Hard-working businessman with a housewife and 2 kids. They could be anyone's next-door neighbor. My wife held the door for a guy that just a few months after this abducted 2 young girls walking home from school. He butchered one girl at a hog confinement, but luckily the other got away. She said that he had dead black eyes like a shark and every hair on her body stood up, and she wanted to get away from this guy ASAP. I was on a subway in Moscow, and I saw this baby, less than 6 months old, but he or she had eyes that could pierce walls. I have never seen anything like it. That baby could stare like an adult can. I think he or she will rule the world. It was nothing short of chilling. I worked at McDonald's and this dude applied. I'm the one who handed him an application. He gave off instant creepy vibes. When he came in for an interview, I told my manager he was weird, but he smiled his way through the interview and got hired. Pretty sure he was a psychopath. And he knew he couldn't fake being a real human in front of me. He would give me real sinister looks behind people's backs. Ended up getting fired. He pushed a big ladder over that almost nailed someone. Camera saw it all. He claimed he was just venting off a little steam. He came back as a customer and reordered the same thing like 10 times, and just creeping up the place and trying to walk into the kitchen, to eat in the break room, etc. Manager finally called the cops. He left and bailed on foot across the highway. Haven't seen him since. Years ago I took a long trip to South America where I backpacked around for like 2 months. On my flight home I had a stopover in La Paz, Bolivia. While sitting around at the terminal waiting for my connecting flight, I heard 5 or 6 guys talking about Texas, where I lived at the time. I also heard some Mexican slang, so I wondered if maybe they were from Texas or possibly Mexico but spent time in Texas. Now for the last 2 weeks of the trip I was traveling by myself, and I spent a lot of time alone and was kind of looking for some conversation. So I went over and said something to them in Spanish like, "Hey, I heard you all talking about Texas. I'm from Austin. Are you from there too?" They all stopped cold and stared at me. One of them broke the silence in a semi-friendly way and said something, I can't really remember what, but then went silent again. I then looked over to one of them who was seated. He was short and was wearing all black and had this black wide-brimmed hat on. He was staring at me from under the brim of his hat with this ice-cold look that sent chills down my spine. I immediately sensed I wasn't welcome and just kind of smiled and said something mundane to the guy who had spoken and awkwardly walked away. I may be being paranoid and reading way too much into this, but my immediate thought, based on their hostile reaction to me, was to wonder if I had just tried to talk to some people who were involved in the drug trade and they wondered if I was some sort of undercover person trying to get close to them. Lol. Probably bullshit, I know. They were probably just wondering who this weirdo was that randomly tried to talk to them in the airport. But I will never forget that dude's stare. It was like he was looking into my soul. Scared the SHT out of me. One New Year's morning at 1:30 or so, I was very drunk in a Chinese restaurant's bar. Having to go pee, I headed to the bathroom where I found the door was jammed. Now this was my favorite shitty dive bar in town, so I knew for a fact the doors didn't lock. And it wasn't one of those solo dumpers, so I pushed harder, started to budge a bit, so I pushed and the door flew open and I stumbled in past a one-eyed guy in a purple suit and into the stall where I urinated loudly. As I finished and was washing my hands, I could feel this guy staring daggers into me. I'm drunk and indestructible, so I didn't really pay him any mind, but it's really weird that this guy is staring at me washing my hands. I dry my hands and get ready to leave when I hear a click, where I look back at the guy and he's got a knife out, points the knife to the counter where, me being oblivious even though I was just washing my hands there, he had a white powder broke into lines. I laugh, he tells me I didn't see shit. My friend the bartender later told me he was a pimp headed back to Las Vegas and got stuck in town. Dude was effed cutthroat. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.